Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Make sure not to miss a single episode and subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Army, or Department of Defense.
Welcome to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm Ron Granieri, professor of history at the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College and podcast editor of the War Room. It's a pleasure to have you with us. For more than 50 years, the U.S. Army War College's Eisenhower Series College Program, or ESCP, has been designed to encourage dialogue on national security and other policy issues between War College students and the broader public. In pursuit of dialogue, War College students in the program travel across the country, speaking to college classes, voluntary organizations, think tanks, and other public forums. Here at A Better Peace, we hope to give our listeners a sense of what the ESCP students present by giving Eisenhower Program participants a chance to share their expertise and insights by offering short versions of their Eisenhower speeches and discussing their personal experiences with the program and at the War College in general. Today's podcast is one in a planned series for the class of 2024. Today's topic is drug interdiction. For decades, the United States has viewed the international drug trade as a national security problem, though the specific military component of the American response has been the subject of intense controversy. Cooperation with international partners to counter drug cartels and manage border security has nevertheless often included military as well as police forces as we all try to understand the nature of the threat and the best strategies in response. Our two guests today, members of the Army War College class of 2024, will draw on their experiences to help us better understand these questions, to consider what drug interdiction will look like in the future. So first, Colonel Don Mozer is an Army officer, a seasoned logistics officer with 20 plus years in the military, commissioned in 2000 at UNC Charlotte. He's led from the platoon to the battalion levels with 3 combat tours. His roles span teaching at West Point and McDaniel College, diverse staff positions, and most recently, overseeing operations at Joint Task Force North. He holds a Ranger tab and combat infantry badge and is finishing the Army War College while pursuing a PhD at the University of Texas at El Paso. Lieutenant Colonel Luis F. Peral is an Army Reserve judge advocate officer and a federal prosecutor on the civilian side, with over 23 years of combined military and prosecutorial experience. Lieutenant Colonel Peral's assignments included that of commander, resident legal advisor, U.S. Embassy Honduras, lead for the Organized Crime and Drug Enforcement Task Forces, and attorney advisor for the Office of Intelligence. Two very busy men. Welcome to A Better Peace, both of you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Ron.
So, Don, I'd like you to go first to let us know what your Eisenhower speech was about.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. So my speech for the Eisenhower program, I had the awesome opportunity over the last 3 years before I got to the War College to be a part of an organization called Joint Task Force North, which is the counter-drug wing for the military. They fall up under NORTHCOM, Northern Command, out of Colorado Springs. Joint Task Force North is in El Paso, Texas. So for 3 years, that's kind of a job that an Army logistician wouldn't normally do. I had the awesome opportunity to be the director of logistics, and then I moved over to be the director of operations in that organization. Joint Task Force North was stood up in 1989 through the National Defense Authorization Act through then President Bush Sr., which basically authorized the military to basically support law enforcement in certain areas when it came to the war on drugs. So with that, Joint Task Force North, they basically support. Currently, while I was there, we were able to support Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, all along and primarily along the southwest border, even though NORTHCOM also has Canada as part of their AO along with Mexico. So with Joint Task Force North being right there in El Paso, we focus primarily on the southwest border And I had an awesome opportunity to travel from Brownsville, Texas, all the way to San Diego, California, and was able to observe operations along all the different ports of entry, as well as going to Mexico a couple of times. So I say all that to say that, someone that is somewhat of a novice when it came to the war on drugs and thought that I could get there and, hey, we're going to solve this problem. I really got an opportunity to look under the tent and basically see how difficult the problem is and how robust and how really it gave me a lot of respect for what our law enforcement have to go through on a daily basis. The other thing that I'd like to point out is that, Mexico is one of our biggest trade partners. I think last year, 2023, they surpassed China and Canada as being the number one trade, $800 billion of trade that goes back and forth along that southwest border. But then you also have transnational criminal organizations that are pushing illegal drugs like methamphetamines, fentanyl, cocaine, heroin that come up through the ports of entry. And I saw a lot of the issues that Department of Homeland Security, DEA, FBI have to deal with. And one of those is because we have such open borders because of economic trade, which is good for both countries, you also have to deal with transnational criminal organizations that's taking advantage of that, pushing these illegal drugs. And some of the, for the military, we're in a support role. We're not law enforcement. So a lot of things that we're doing is as far as sharing intel information. We also augment Border Patrol with personnel to help out with observation posts. We can't arrest anyone. We also do a lot of interdiction with aviation support. So those are kind of the primary means that we support law enforcement because there's, you got posse comitatus, you have a lot of other different laws that doesn't allow us to, be law enforcement basically. So when you look at what the military is doing, it's a tough job. And I would just also like to point out that some of the things I learned, because, illegal drugs have a huge influence in the United States as far as we know the fentanyl deaths is terrible, the violence and gang violence that it creates in some of our inner cities. So these are major concerns that we have as far as me personally. That's why I was wanted to do this position to really find out how we could better support it. But you find out that, hey, these are difficult problem sets. So, the one thing that I think going forward is the technology at the border is one of the things that I think we have to look at going forward as far as X-ray machines. That was one of the major issues that I saw on the border is that we only scan about 20% of all vehicles that go back and forth. So those are some things I know the current administration's is in the budget put out for DHS to get a lot more funding for technology along the border. And we're also having to grow Customs and Border Protection, Border Patrol. That's after 9/11, DHS was established, and you kind of combine Customs, Border Patrol, and some of the other agencies to help out with a lot of our border issues. But it takes time to grow. So when people are like, hey, why is the military supporting DHS when it comes to counter drug, is really because we're still having to grow some of these organizations that were just created. And when you see how big the DOD budget is, people are always going to lean on DOD because, we have one of the larger budgets. But those are some of the issues that I saw on the border, and it was just an awesome opportunity. And I really, like I said, have a lot of respect for our law enforcement and the problems that they're dealing with along the border.
Sure. That's great. Luis?
Hey, Ron, thank you for having me here. And, I was sitting in my, strategic leadership class, and we were talking about readiness. Mm-hmm. And I thought, you know what? Fentanyl readiness, recruitment, how does that affect the United States military? Mm-hmm. And then I thought, I have some experience with the fentanyl crisis. I've been a prosecutor for almost 20 years. So and also on my military side, I've actually worked with the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, which has a big role in when we do these south of the border kind of operations. So I began to look at it, the problem set from a DOD lens, south of the border. And that's before we started talking about at the Eisenhower program what our topics were. And I heard that Don was going to have drugs too, so we figured, hey, let's divide it up. We're going to take NORTHCOM and I'll take SOUTHCOM. Let's see how we can work it out. And that's how we kind of divided it up. My topic really concentrates on DOD's participation in the war on drugs. Mm-hmm. which is a bit of a misnomer, really. It's not really a war on drugs. It's law enforcement action, and DOD is supporting that action for the most part. But I looked at what I call the unholy trinity, and that is production, distribution, and demand. And you can really collapse production and distribution together and then put them on one side and then have demand. And you'll see that's kind of the ongoing theme in my presentation is that, what are we doing to address production and distribution? But more importantly, as a solution, what about the demand? And I think that's something that we have to really look at. So starting off with Plan Colombia, we know back in 2000, when it started to 2015, that was a huge program, really a State Department-led, but the U.S. military was involved. DOD was involved in that, providing certain assets, training, communication, and that, for the most part, has been what the Department of Defense has done throughout the years. A lot of training, and I'll get to more specifics about that, but training, partnering up with host nation partners, whether Colombians or in Central America, not Central America so much, but Peru at the time, and then providing equipment that they needed and resources. Obviously, State Department being the main force there and Plan Colombia, but obviously DOD having a supporting role. And then we look at about interdiction. We talked about that. What are the laws? What are the authorities? Looking at 10 U.S.C. 284, which is pretty recent, but it lays out all the authorities, the left and right of DOD, what they can do, which is really a supporting role. And I'm not going to touch too much on the NORTHCOM side, because I know that Don is going to talk about that. But on the SOUTHCOM side, they do have they're there to provide resources to our partners, whether it be through detection and monitoring, communications. And what does that mean? And I like to bring it into how that comes into even with local law enforcement, meaning not local law enforcement, federal law enforcement, when I worked on the civilian side, is that you'll have, at any time, you have various ships, whether it be fast boats, slower ones that are bringing the loads. And what do I mean by the loads? Those are the shipments of cocaine. Cocaine, heroin, and they're bulky. So in the beginning, back in the 80s, 90s, 2000, a lot of these shipments were just put on en masse. They had tonnage. So you would have a lot of seizures. And this gets into measuring success, right? And I can talk about that, how we have measured success throughout, I would say, different periods. And not to jump off a little bit, but for a very long time, it was how much tonnage are we getting, right? Yep. What can we show that we've done? And that was easy because a lot of the routes, I'm going to say most, if not Dr. Garris will kill me for not being critically a thinker here, but using the weasel words, but they were coming through South Florida. Okay? And that's where you had the shipments coming in. They were either directly going into the Florida coastline or were being dropped off in the Caribbean. And then you would have these Miami Vice, what I call Miami Vice boats, coming into the Bahamas, or not to name these other countries, but pick up the load and just drop it into Florida. After the 90s, that became harder. So because of the excellent work of our interagency working together with DOD to push and to create a shield around the peninsula there, Florida and the Gulf Coast, the drug routes went westward. And at the same time, you have to realize that what do we have happening? We have development in Central South America. You have NAFTA happening. You want free trade going in back and forth, and that's what Don was talking about earlier. We have all this great trade relations with Mexico and other countries in South America and Central America. So that is moving to the west. There's the infrastructure being built through these roads that go from basically almost the point of Argentina all the way to the northern part of Mexico. And you have the drug dealers, which are, and we can talk at length about them, they're creative, they're innovative, they're constantly one-upping us on their techniques and their capabilities, started to move and use those routes. And, well, then you have certain destabilization factors. And what do I talk about that? Because that's what these programs, since Plan Colombia tries to do, is bring in stability through stable governments, the rule of law, and training. So you're going to see that's a theme throughout the way that we've fought sort of war on drugs. Now, we have a new crisis, which is fentanyl. And fentanyl produces a new set of problems for law enforcement, because why I mentioned earlier that the bulkiness of the kilos of cocaine or heroin, that 2.2 kilos or pounds is a kilo, and it takes space. Well, when you're dealing with fentanyl, which is I think 2023, we lost about 100,000 lives were lost related to fentanyl overdoses. You can put that in very small packaging and have a very potent effect. Okay, so there was a great picture, and you can go, I don't know if it's still there, but if you go to the DA, the Drug Enforcement Agency's website, they had a quarter, and they had a couple of grains of fentanyl, and that was enough to cause a lot of damage and death in some of the people in the room if they were in there. To be fair, that depends on how your body's going to react to it, but there's a tendency to have problems with it. So that creates an important practical effect in how we can stop the flow. And then you have Mexico, like it was mentioned before, where you have all the precursor chemicals coming in there. And these clandestine labs are putting it together and then shipping it into the United States, easily secreted in many things.
I was thinking about this talking beforehand, that one of the big points with fentanyl and also with methamphetamine is you're talking about drugs that are artificial, can be created in a lab. So when I think about traditionally heroin, marijuana, and cocaine, right? Somebody has to grow a plant. And so you can find a field of poppies and you can burn the poppy fields. You can burn the coca leaves. With fentanyl, right? If the chemicals can be made perfectly legitimately, and then they are brought together wherever they can be brought together.
And that's a great point, Ron. Actually, we had a problem here in the United States of homegrown methamphetamines. We used to call that shake and bake, right?
Right.
And you would have not only these labs that you see in Breaking Bad, I think that's the name of the show, right? It became very popular, kind of cool show. But you'll have mom and pops basically creating their own methamphetamines by very, very easy ways. But you know what happened, right? That the drug cartels improved the product. They made it so you almost got 100% pure quality off the methamphetamine, and now they're doing it in Mexico. And why you're going to take the risk? Have to get the ingredients where you can get a better product for less of a price.
Indeed. Well, and this gets to a larger question. I mean, first of all, yes, it turns out the cartels did not rely on on a high school chemistry teacher with cancer in order to figure out how to make better meth. But there is a larger issue, and something that you brought up, Don, and something that you were talking about too, Luis. Now, Don has the misfortune of having been in my seminar here at the War College. So if you talk about Professor Garris getting on you, right? But Don's heard me say what I'm about to say many times. But one of the really complicated issues when you're in strategic leadership is when you're presented with a problem or a question, is you want to answer it. When actually, because there may not be only one answer, it's not about answering the question, it's about responding to it. And the same thing with a problem, like the drug problem. There is a desire to solve a problem, perfectly natural desire. But some problems don't lend themselves to very clear solutions. So instead, you have to manage the problem. And so when you think about drugs in particular, right? As Don, you mentioned, you went in thinking, I'm going to come in, I'm going to figure out how we're going to put a stop to this. But how do we, how do the professionals, when you think about the people that you two have studied and you've worked with, how do the professionals deal with the tension between the desire to solve a problem and the reality of managing it? And how should we talk to the public about sort of our awareness of there's a delta between solving and managing? I'm going to go to you first, Don, and then you to Luis.
Thanks, Ron. And it was great having you for the last year or two. I can blame you or my next commander will thank you for how well I do. But I would say it's tough. I had the opportunity to go to a couple of law enforcement conferences where you got to interact with DEA, FBI, and a lot of other three-letter agencies that are lifelong law enforcement and tackling this problem for a long time. And I think of one conversation I had with a DEA agent, and a lot of times, you hear talk about like, hey, we need to, destroy these cartels. Mm-hmm. And he had been in long enough to where, we have dismantled several cartels. And, the issue is that they break off and create new cells. And me and Luis both talked about them. Now I think because the drug problem's been going on for about 50 years now, and I think people are beginning to realize that it's more than just law enforcement, and even law enforcement are coming to the realization that I think we got to put more effort towards public health and educating our population on the danger. And we've done that some, but really looking at why is the demand so high? Because as long as the demand is there, it's going to continually be difficult, especially when we're talking about these drugs that can be made in somebody's basement, whether in Mexico or here in the United States. As long as there's a demand, there's going to be people out here trying to, make profit off of it. So when you ask the question of how does law enforcement look at it as far as management, I think they understand the problem more than anyone. The issue is I think we probably do have to do a better job of educating the population on how difficult the problem is and how demand is really affecting their ability to really end this war on drugs per se.
Fair. Luis?
Okay, so I'm going to give my comments, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of slack when I get back to the office with all my DEA and FBI.
Don't worry. Just remember, we have a standard disclaimer. You're only speaking for yourself. So
Thank you.
You're off the hook.
All right, thank you very much. So, I've been in this war for over 20 years.
Yeah.
I cut my teeth on doing street level hand-to-hands where you see on the wire when the guy pulls up in the car, he hands him a little package and money is being handed to the person and that's where it starts, right? That's the deal, the what they call pitching in the South, or trapping, right? A trap house where they sell the drugs out of, into the sophisticated international extradition, working with our partners in Colombia, then providing intelligence using sophisticated means to use that, getting him into authorized methods so we can use it in federal court. So I've done all that.
Sure.
And the mindset has always been, when I started off as a young prosecutor who was at the seizure, hey, how many, I seized two, I didn't seize it, but my agents did.
Sure.
2 tons of drugs. I'm great. I'm doing a great job here.
Because you can measure it.
I can measure it. But you know what? There's more. There's tons and tons more coming in the next day. Then we switched on to, let's follow the money. Because cartels have a hard time. That was a concept. Cartels have a hard time. Well, they can get maybe a kilo of cocaine in Colombia for about $100 or less, or a little bit more, depending on the way the rates are going. They have a hard time recouping that. If we take their money, they're going to have a hard time recouping that. So it's all about money laundering. Now we're going to go after the money, the financial investigations, the structures, and then you got a little bit into narco-terrorism in there. The FARC in Colombia, and Southern District of New York does a great job of dismantling these organizations and these cartels. What's next? Well, now we're going to go after the big Mexican cartels, like it was mentioned earlier. Well, what happens? Well, they just reconstitute. Why? Because there's a demand. And I tend to disagree with some people who say that we should declare them terrorist organizations. They're not. They're criminal organizations, sophisticated, organized, but they're there for a profit. So as long as that profit is still coming in, you're still going to have the drug production. So as Don was saying, I began to shift a little bit. Not that I'm saying that we do not concentrate on the production distribution, but on the third prong of that unholy trinity, we have to look at the demand. And how do we do that? We've done that. We go back into the ad campaign since the 1970s. Really was started by Richard Nixon, President Nixon at the time, the war on drugs. And then you move forward, you have, a picture of a frying pan. This is your brain's frying. I looked these up on the net, and this is your brain frying.
Kids ask your parents.
Kids ask your parents. Great ads, wonderful image. Or you have these programs, and I've been part of those. We go to schools as a public outreach. And we tell them with former users that have been users of drugs or dealers or gang members, and tell them how bad these things were and they shouldn't do that. And that's great. But that is a short time frame within 12 years of schooling. That's not, I believe, long enough, or the message is not really saturating in those kids. So what I think we should do is that you need to look at it, a culture change completely. You need to bring in not only the federal agencies, including the education department, but all agencies, because everyone has a stake in this. This is the whole nation approach, where you bring in not only ADA and FBI, Department of Justice, but all these other agencies, but also the military, because they're a stakeholder. They're a stakeholder because those graduates from 12th grade on, they're going to become recruits. That's a vulnerability. You mentioned that earlier. And it affects readiness. It could affect readiness. What do? You bring in business, insurances. Why? Because they have an interest. The fewer people are falling with afflictions of drug use, they're going to have fewer claims. Very black and white here. And medical health profession, to be able to create curriculums, and I'm not talking about propaganda, pro-military, pro-government, no, but something that is civic in a way that is going to benefit those students, is going to, what I call, inoculate them against the permissiveness of using drugs, right?
You see, this is a fascinating point. I was thinking about drugs having the earlier versions of the vision of the war on drugs, and about collecting and intervening. I'm old enough to remember in the French Connection when they find all the heroin in the rocker panels of a 1970 Ford, and so you can hide drugs in a lot of places, but you don't have to hide the drugs if nobody wants to buy them, right? And this I like this point that you make, Luis, that to deal with to think about the cartels as businesses, right? That if they weren't making money on it, they wouldn't be doing it. And where are they making money on it? Because people are buying it. And I look forward to the messages we get in response to the show as a result of what I just said. But be that as it may. But this is a controversial question. I'm going to ask it. You can decide whether you want to answer it. Is what role can or should managed decriminalization play in the war on drugs?
That's a good question, Ron. I mean, being African American, that affects my community a lot. Sure. A lot of advocates in the African American community say, "Hey, it's been overly criminalized." So, but at the same time, it's a lot of people also say it causes a lot of crime, violence. So there's a balance there. I think with some, the Schedule I drugs, when you start talking about heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, a lot of those drugs, we got to be careful. And, there's some experiments going on right now. If you look at Oregon, you can also study what's going on in Portugal. That country's decriminalized it. So there's some areas I think we got to look at it. I don't think we need to just make everything legal and not have studied and understand the repercussions and what could potentially come out of that. So I think it needs to be studied, and I think there's got to be a balance somewhere.
Sure. Luis, you're a lawyer. What do you think?
I'm against it.
Yeah. All right.
And I'll come out and say it. I think that what are you trying to do with decriminalization, right? I mean, you're still going to have addiction. You're still going to have people dying. I mean, you might be able to regulate it to a certain degree. You might be able to maybe give them the right dose, give them the right needles. That's been tried in Europe, so you won't get HIV or any other, blood communicable diseases. But we're not getting at the dependency problem. We're not getting at the death problems. We're going to give physicals to everyone that we're going to give drugs to make sure their heart is working right, or their liver. I mean, we're getting rid of cigarettes. Now we're going to allow them to use, heroin or cocaine. I don't think so. I think we need to reevaluate maybe the sentencing. I think we're doing that. I think this administration is doing that. I think that they've come down to realization that we can't incarcerate our way out of the problem because it has a disparate impact on various communities. But ultimately, we have to have those future generations that we can influence have that choice. And I'll give you an example, and this might be completely wrong, but let's say that we are able to stop all the drugs from coming into the country. Let's say that we're able to lock down the border, no trade. I mean, we're going to do this. Well, let's say they come up with, that's a lot of let's says here. Let's say they come up with a technology where you go into a website and it shoots something in your eye, you look at it, and it could be done, or it stimulates and creates this hallucinogenic effect or just like a drug. How are we going to be able to stop that? I mean, you stop that by creating this inoculation concept, by letting our children, our future generations of service members or future workforce in the federal workforce or just in the general workforce saying, you know what, I'm not going to make that choice. And there's a lot of other things that have to work down in there, but that's the way I would do it. I wouldn't just say, I'm going to allow you to use drugs because we cannot come up with a creative way of stopping the drug flows.
That's an interesting way to put it, right? Is that the problem is, or the ideal solution is whether the drugs we can't make the drugs no longer exist, right? These drugs have existed for a long time. The goal should be to encourage people to think about doing other things with their lives than using these drugs. And so making it more difficult to get them is one way to do that, but it can't be the only way. It's an interesting question. I think about this as a former smoker, right? One of the reasons why I gave up smoking is because it got harder and harder to do it. And after a while, it's like, well, because if you have to go off into a special place to do it, you have a lot of time to think about what an idiotic thing you're doing. Now, if we could do something like that, but this then becomes this is a much longer term challenge. And so my big final question for both of you is if we agree that this is the kind of long-term whole of society sort of challenge, is how can or should our major institutions communicate to the public, right, that we're thinking about this long-term, that success is going to be measured also in the long term, not just in tons of cocaine interdicted, or the famous the street value argument, which always is inflated so many times to make it sound really impressive, right? If somebody was to ask you, Don, right, so how should I as an American citizen think about our future approach to the war on drugs, right? What should I be hopeful? But if I'm hopeful, what should I be hoping for?
No, I would definitely say we should be hopeful. I mean, I like I said, I think we got to look at it. The one big thing the takeaway I would say is that Mexico is one of our biggest partners. $800 billion of trade. I think we got to support Mexico in some of their issues. I think Mexico wants our help in a lot of areas. The transnational criminal organizations and gangs in Mexico, I read a study, are the 5th largest employer in Mexico. So I think we have to do something about unemployment. We talk about international relations theories in your class, Ron. I think deep engagement was one of those theories, and I think we got to really look at if Mexico's truly our partner, what can we do to help dissolve in the young people's mindset there in Mexico that are joining the gangs, joining the cartels? How can we help them not want to be a part of those organizations? And I think that'll help decrease it. And I have hope, like I said, because we have such a strong tie with Mexico, the culture. If you go along the border of Mexico, there's a strong culture and strong ties with Mexico, and I think that gives me hope that I think overall, long term, we can solve the problem.
That's great, Luis.
I think if you talk to the American people and you explain to them that, look, your children, your future generations are going to have a benefit from this, because, I mean, we can't guarantee that they won't be using drugs or selling drugs, but we can give them at least the tools of the environment that they're not going to be able to do that, or won't be able to do that, or choose not to do that, probably more accurately. I think they would be able to accept that. And it's going to it's long term, it's generational, across elementary, junior high, and high school. You have to do that. You can't stop in one shop at elementary school. You have to keep reinforcing the message on and on and on. And I think if you bring in business, there will be more buy-in in that because they have a future workforce.
Well, that's great. Well, when we think about the future, right, dealing with the problems of the future requires thoughtful application of ideas in the present, and it's nice to see what you, Don Mozer, and what you, Luis Peral, have been thinking about this. We didn't get a chance to talk about your experience at the War College, but you seem reasonably well adjusted to me, so I hope that means that you've had a good year at the War College.
Great year.
It's been great having you both on A Better Peace, so thanks, Luis Peral. Thanks, Don Mozer, for being guests here.
Thanks, Ron. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Ron. Pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for listening in. Please send us your comments on this program and all the programs. Send us your suggestions for future programs. We're always interested in hearing from you. Please take a moment and reflect on your own long-term future by subscribing to A Better Peace so that you can never miss an episode. And once you have subscribed to A Better Peace, please take a moment and rate and review this podcast on your podcatcher of choice, because that's how more people can find out about us. We're always interested in growing the community for conversations like this one. And even though this conversation is over, we look forward to welcoming you to the next one. And so, until next time, from the War Room, I'm Ron Granieri.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu, and have a great day.